The bank was unusually quiet for a Friday morning. The faint sound of a pen scratching paper echoed through the walls as customers came and went, their voices hushed in the otherwise serene environment. It was a typical setting for the woman who entered the bank that day. She had visited the same branch countless times before, never expecting anything out of the ordinary. She had come to take care of a few routine tasks: deposit a check, handle some account details, and perhaps ask a few questions about her savings account. Little did she know, the day would turn into something far more frustrating. She stepped through the sliding glass doors with a sense of calm, dressed in a business suit that matched her sharp, professional demeanor. As a successful entrepreneur, she had learned early on that every detail counted. The way you dressed, the way you spoke, the way you carried yourself, all of these things formed an image that the world often judged you by. And she knew that, as a black woman in a predominantly white space, she had to work twice as hard to be taken seriously. She approached the front desk where a young bank teller was sorting through some paperwork. He looked up briefly, his eyes scanning her face, but his expression didn't soften. There was no greeting, no attempt to make eye contact, and certainly no smile. In that brief moment, she could already tell something was off. But she brushed it off, telling herself it was probably just a busy morning. "Good morning," she said, trying to break the silence. Her voice was steady, polite, and neutral, just as it had always been in situations like this. The teller barely acknowledged her greeting, his eyes flickering back to his work. After a moment, he grunted, motioning for her to come forward. She could see his disinterest in the task at hand, and something about his tone felt dismissive, though she couldn't pinpoint why. She took a deep breath, reminding herself that her time at the bank was limited. "I'd like to make a deposit and ask about some options for my savings account," she said. The teller didn't look up from his desk, his fingers moving over the keyboard as he muttered something under his breath. It wasn't a question or even an acknowledgement of her request, just a few random words that she couldn't quite catch. She blinked, confused, but didn't say anything. She placed the deposit slip on the counter and waited, trying her best to remain patient. It felt like an eternity before the teller finally raised his head. When he did, his eyes flickered toward the slip of paper and then back to her, but his expression remained cold. He didn't smile, nor did he make any effort to make her feel comfortable. His body language screamed impatience as he began to process the deposit, almost as though he was irritated by her presence. She had encountered unprofessional behavior at the bank before, maybe not to this extent, but she had learned to let it go. It wasn't worth causing a scene, especially over something as minor as a rude cashier. But the more she observed him, the more she began to feel uneasy. There was something about the way he kept avoiding her gaze, the way his eyes seemed to narrow when she asked a simple question. Her mind raced as she tried to focus on the task at hand. She needed to get her business done and leave quickly. But despite her best efforts, she could feel the frustration creeping in. It was a subtle thing, but it gnawed at her, a sense that she wasn't being treated fairly. She knew what it was like to be underestimated, to be overlooked simply because of the color of her skin. It had happened before, many times, in ways both large and small. But for some reason, today felt different. The tension in the air was palpable, thick with something unsaid. As she waited for the teller to finish his task, she scanned the bank around her. It was a typical suburban branch, bright, clean, and quiet. The walls were decorated with corporate advertisements, and a few large posters showing happy customers made their way down the hallway. In the corner, a small television played a news broadcast that no one seemed to pay attention to. Everything was just so ordinary. But the woman couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about this encounter. The teller finally finished entering her information into the system and handed her a receipt, his eyes darting toward the next customer without any acknowledgement of her presence. She took the paper, her fingers curling around it tightly. There was no thank you or have a nice day, no small talk or pleasantries. It was as if she was just another task to check off the list, a brief stop in his day that held no significance. She turned to leave, but just as she stepped away from the counter, something unexpected happened. The teller reached out, not with an open hand, but in a quick, jerking motion, pushing her lightly but firmly back toward the counter. Her body swayed, and for a moment, she felt a brief flash of panic. It wasn't much, just a small push, but it was enough to throw her off balance. The woman took a step back, surprised. Her heart raced slightly as she looked at the teller. He didn't seem to notice her reaction. His eyes were still glued to the screen in front of him, focused entirely on whatever task he was working on. He seemed completely oblivious to the fact that his actions had startled her. "Excuse me," she said, her voice rising slightly, a mix of confusion and disbelief. The teller didn't even acknowledge her. He kept typing, his eyes fixed on the computer. It was as if she hadn't spoken at all. For a moment, the woman stood there, frozen. Her mind raced as she tried to process what had just happened. The push hadn't been violent, but it had been deliberate, and it had certainly been unwarranted. She felt a wave of frustration wash over her, a mixture of anger and confusion. Why had he done that? Was it intentional? Was it just an accident? In that moment, she realized something that made her blood run cold. This man had no idea who she was. He didn't know that she had been a loyal client of this bank for years, that her business accounted for a significant portion of their revenue. He had no idea that she was the reason this branch still existed, the reason it could afford to stay open. If he had known who she was, would he have treated her differently? Would he have thought twice before pushing her aside like a piece of furniture? But there was no way to undo what had happened. She could feel the anger bubbling up inside her, but she didn't want to make a scene. The last thing she needed was to give this teller any more attention. He wasn't worth it. She turned on her heel and walked toward the exit, her mind racing with a mix of emotions. But one thing was clear, this was far from over. Something had to change, and she wouldn't let it go. The woman stepped out of the bank and into the bright sunlight, the door closing behind her with a soft swoosh. She could feel the warmth of the early afternoon on her skin, but the air didn't feel as fresh as it usually did. Her mind was still reeling from the awkward interaction inside the bank, and the more she thought about it, the more unsettled she felt. As she walked down the sidewalk toward her car, her thoughts kept returning to the way the teller had acted. She couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in her mind, the cold greeting, the dismissive attitude, and, worst of all, the moment he had pushed her away. It wasn't a full-on shove, but it was enough to throw her off balance, both physically and emotionally. She hadn't expected that kind of behavior from a bank employee, especially one working at a branch she had trusted for so long. The woman reached her car, unlocked it, and slid into the driver's seat, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. She let out a long breath and closed her eyes for a moment, trying to calm herself. She didn't want to overreact, but the more she thought about it, the more she felt like she had been disrespected. It wasn't just the way the teller had treated her, it was the underlying feeling of being overlooked, of being seen as less than human because of the color of her skin. She knew that this wasn't the first time she had experienced something like this. Over the years, she had faced subtle discrimination in many forms: an extra long wait in a store, a cold shoulder at a social event, or an assumption that she wasn't capable of handling something that she knew she was more than qualified for. She had learned to brush these things off, to move forward with grace, even when it stung. But this felt different. It wasn't just a cold shoulder or a dismissive look, it was an action, a physical act that crossed a line. The woman's phone buzzed, breaking her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen and saw a message from her business partner, asking if she was available for a quick call. She opened the message, typed a quick reply, and then put the phone down, realizing she wasn't in the mood for a conversation just yet. Instead, She turned the key in the ignition and pulled out of the parking lot, her mind still on the events inside the bank. As she drove, she began to think about her relationship with the bank. She had been a loyal customer for years, and her account had grown steadily over time. She had always felt like her business was valued there. After all, she was one of the bank's largest clients. She had trusted them with her savings and investments, and they had rewarded her loyalty with decent service. But now, she couldn't shake the feeling that maybe she had been taken for granted. Maybe her business wasn't as important to them as she had once thought. Her mind raced as she tried to make sense of everything. Was the teller's behavior an isolated incident, or was it a sign of a larger issue within the bank? She couldn't be sure. She had always been careful to avoid making assumptions about people based on their race or background, but in this case, it seemed hard to ignore the possibility that racial prejudice had played a role in the way she had been treated. She thought back to the moment when she had seen the top client's poster on the wall of the bank. Her name was on it, clearly visible among the other names listed as the bank's most valued clients. She remembered feeling a surge of pride as she saw her name, knowing that her hard work had contributed to the bank's success. But now, as she replayed the interaction in her head, she wondered if that mattered to the teller. Did he even know who she was? Did he care? She thought about calling the bank to report the incident, but then she stopped herself. What would that accomplish? She had no proof that the teller's behavior was racially motivated, and even if she did, what kind of response could she expect? Would they even take her seriously, or would they just apologize and move on, as so many businesses did when issues of race were raised? Still, something inside her told her that she couldn't let this go. She had worked too hard for too long to be treated like she was invisible, like her business didn't matter. She had a responsibility to herself, to her community, and to others who might be facing the same kinds of struggles to stand up and demand better. She wasn't going to let one person's careless actions define her experience at the bank. The woman pulled into her driveway and put the car in park. She sat there for a few moments, looking out the window at the quiet street. It was hard to shake the feeling of being wronged, of being reduced to something less than what she was, a successful, respected woman who had built her life from the ground up. She had spent so many years fighting for equality, for the right to be treated with dignity and respect, and now here she was, dealing with a moment that seemed so small, yet felt so significant. After a few more minutes of contemplation, she grabbed her phone and dialed the bank's customer service line. She hesitated for a second, wondering if she was making too big of a deal out of it. But deep down, she knew this wasn't just about her, this was about something bigger. This was about the way people of color, especially black women, were often treated in spaces where they were expected to be invisible. The phone rang a few times before someone picked up. The woman explained her situation briefly, keeping her tone calm but firm. She didn't want to make it sound like she was accusing the bank of anything, but she wanted them to understand how she had been made to feel. She didn't want an apology, not really. What she wanted was for them to understand that this kind of behavior couldn't be ignored, not anymore. She didn't expect the bank to change overnight, but she hoped her call would be the first step in making them see that their actions, or in this case, the lack of them, had consequences. The representative on the other end of the line listened patiently, taking down her information and promising that someone would get back to her as soon as possible. The woman thanked them, hung up, and sat back in her chair, feeling a small sense of relief. It wasn't much, but it was a start. As she sat there, she realized that, no matter what happened, she wasn't going to let this one incident define her. She wasn't going to let the actions of one careless teller ruin her faith in the entire bank. She would continue to be a loyal customer, but now with a heightened awareness of the world around her. She would continue to fight for the respect she deserved, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. The days that followed the incident at the bank were a blur. The woman went through her usual routine work, meetings, phone calls, but her mind kept returning to the events that had unfolded so unexpectedly. Every time she passed by the bank or thought about the teller's dismissive behavior, a knot formed in her stomach. She couldn't shake the feeling that something needed to be done. She knew that if she let this go, it would be just another moment of injustice brushed under the rug. But this time, she was determined to make her voice heard. She had made the call to customer service, as difficult as it had been. When the representative on the phone had assured her that someone would follow up, she had expected the usual corporate response, a polite apology and a vague promise that the issue would be addressed. But she knew this wasn't just about her, it was about the principle of being treated with respect and dignity in every setting, even in places like the bank. She wasn't going to let them forget what had happened. That afternoon, a couple of days after her phone call, she received an email from the bank. The subject line read, "Your recent experience with our branch." She opened it eagerly, her heart pounding a little faster than usual. The email was from the branch manager, and it was clear from the tone that they had taken the matter seriously. The message began with a formal apology for the incident, acknowledging the way the teller had treated her. There was a long paragraph about how the bank valued all of its clients and was committed to providing a welcoming environment for everyone. The manager explained that they had spoken with the teller and would be conducting further training to ensure that something like this would never happen again. As she read through the email, she felt a small sense of relief. The bank was taking responsibility, and she appreciated that. However, she also knew that actions spoke louder than words. The apology was a start, but she needed to see real change. She needed to know that this kind of behavior wouldn't just be swept under the rug, that the bank was truly committed to treating every customer fairly, regardless of their background. The woman picked up the phone and dialed the number in the email. She was connected to the branch manager almost immediately. His voice was calm and reassuring, and he began by reiterating the apology in the email. "I want to personally apologize for what happened," he said. "We take this matter very seriously, and we're grateful you brought it to our attention." She listened closely, nodding as he spoke. His words were comforting, but she still had her doubts. She knew that actions had to match words. "I appreciate the apology," she said after a brief pause, "but I want to make sure this is more than just an apology. I want to know that the bank is taking steps to ensure something like this never happens again. It's not just about me, it's about making sure every customer feels safe and respected here." The manager was quiet for a moment, and then he spoke again. "You're absolutely right," he said. "I want you to know that we are taking this seriously. We've already begun reviewing our customer service training, and the teller in question is receiving additional sensitivity and diversity training. I assure you that this kind of behavior won't be tolerated." The woman felt a slight sense of relief, but there was still a lingering concern. "What about the other staff members?" she asked. "How do I know this issue isn't going to happen again with someone else? It's not just about one person, it's about creating an environment where everyone feels welcome." The manager seemed to appreciate her directness. "We're addressing this at all levels," he explained. "We're planning a series of workshops on diversity, inclusion, and unconscious bias for all of our employees. We'll be evaluating our training programs to make sure that they're more effective and that everyone understands the importance of treating all clients with respect." The woman nodded, feeling a bit more hopeful. "I'm glad to hear that. I've been a loyal client of this bank for years, and I want to continue that relationship. But I need to know that the bank is truly committed to doing the right thing." "I understand," the manager said sincerely. "Your loyalty means a lot to us. And I want to personally ensure that this issue is resolved to your satisfaction. We're also going to make sure that your experience is a catalyst for positive change here." After a few more minutes of discussion, the woman thanked the manager for his time. She hung up the phone, feeling a little lighter. While she wasn't completely convinced that the bank had fixed everything just yet, it was clear that they were making an effort. And that, she thought, was a step in the right direction. The next day, she received another email from the bank, this time from the teller himself. It was brief but to the point, an apology for his actions and a promise that he would work to improve his behavior in the future. She couldn't help but appreciate the sincerity in his words. She wasn't sure if he fully understood the weight of the situation, but she recognized that at least he had taken responsibility. As the days went by, the woman continued with her usual routine, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the events at the bank. She began to notice things she hadn't before: the subtle ways in which people were treated differently depending on their background, their appearance, or their status. It was a realization that wasn't entirely new to her, but it felt more urgent now. She wasn't going to ignore it. She would continue to stand up for herself and for others who might be facing similar challenges. One afternoon, she decided to stop by the bank in person. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just to get some closure, or perhaps she wanted to see for herself if the changes they had promised were actually taking place. When she walked in, the atmosphere felt a little different. The tellers seemed more engaged with the customers, and there was a noticeable shift in the way they interacted with each person who came up to the counter. She noticed the same teller who had been involved in the incident. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment, they locked eyes. He gave her a hesitant smile, and she returned it with a nod. He had clearly been doing some self-reflection, and though she wasn't sure how much he had truly learned, she appreciated the effort. The woman approached the counter and completed her business. The transaction was smooth, and the teller was polite and professional throughout. It wasn't perfect. There were still some awkward moments, and she could tell he was still nervous, but it was clear that he was trying. And for her, that was enough, for now. As she left the bank, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. It wasn't a complete resolution, but it was a start. The woman knew that change didn't happen overnight. But she also knew that by speaking up, she had made a difference not just for herself, but for others who might have faced the same kind of treatment. And as she drove away from the bank that day, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. She had taken a stand, and no matter how small it seemed, it mattered. It was a reminder that, even in the face of injustice, one person's voice could create ripples of change. The days following the conversation with the bank manager felt like a strange mix of anticipation and uncertainty. The woman couldn't stop thinking about the promises that had been made, promises of change, of improvement, of accountability. She had been around long enough to know that words were easy to say, but real change often took time. Still, she had a glimmer of hope. She wanted to believe that the bank was sincere in its efforts to make things right. After all, they had apologized, and they had taken action, or at least claimed to. For the next few weeks, she went about her normal routine, trying not to dwell too much on the issue. She focused on her business, her clients, and her personal life. But every now and then, her mind would wander back to the encounter at the bank. She couldn't help but wonder how much progress had actually been made. Was the teller truly changing? Was the bank as committed to addressing the underlying issues as they said they were? One day, she received another email from the branch manager, and her heart skipped a beat when she saw his name in her inbox. She clicked it open, curious about what he had to say this time. The subject line read, "Follow up, our commitment to improving your experience." The email was reassuring. The manager expressed his gratitude for her patience and understanding and reassured her that the bank was following through on the diversity and sensitivity training. He mentioned that all staff members were now required to attend a series of workshops focused on cultural awareness and inclusivity. Furthermore, he explained that the bank was taking additional steps to create a more welcoming environment for all customers, with special attention to addressing any biases that might exist, whether intentional or unconscious. The manager also informed her that they had implemented a new feedback system where clients could anonymously rate their experiences at the bank. This was a part of the bank's effort to hold employees accountable and ensure that all customers felt heard and respected. He invited her to provide feedback on her most recent experience if she felt comfortable doing so, promising that it would be carefully reviewed and used to improve the service further. The woman sat back in her chair and took a deep breath. There was no denying it, the bank was taking steps to address the issue, and they seemed to be following through with their commitments. But she knew that the real test would be in how these changes played out in practice. She decided to respond to the email, thanking the manager for his continued attention to the matter and offering to meet in person to discuss her experience further. She wanted to be sure that they were genuinely interested in creating a lasting change, not just a temporary fix. A few days later, she received a response, and soon she was scheduled to meet with the manager at the bank. She arrived at the branch with mixed feelings. Part of her was hopeful that real progress had been made, while another part of her remained skeptical. She couldn't help it, after years of seeing similar promises go unfulfilled, it was hard to believe that things could truly be different. When she arrived at the bank, the atmosphere felt noticeably different. There was a new energy in the air, an openness, a sense that people were genuinely trying to make things better. The tellers were smiling as they greeted customers, and the overall vibe seemed warmer and more inviting. The woman felt a small surge of hope. Perhaps, just perhaps, things were starting to change. The manager met her in the lobby and led her to a quiet conference room. He was warm and polite, offering her a seat and a bottle of water before they began their conversation. She could tell that he was genuinely interested in her thoughts and feedback, and that made her feel heard. "I want to thank you again for giving us the opportunity to address your concerns," the manager said, his voice sincere. "I know this has been an uncomfortable situation, and I truly appreciate your willingness to work with us to make things right. We've made some significant changes, and we're committed to keeping this momentum going." The woman nodded, appreciating his honesty. "I can tell that there's been a shift in the atmosphere here," she said, glancing around the room. "The staff seems more engaged, and there's a sense of positivity in the air. That's a good sign." "I'm glad to hear that," the manager replied. "We've been working hard to make sure that every customer feels welcome and valued, no matter who they are. We've also put systems in place to ensure that employees understand the importance of empathy and respect in every interaction." The woman listened carefully, intrigued by the manager's commitment to change. "I appreciate what you've done so far," she said. "But the real question is whether these changes are sustainable. It's easy to say the right things and make promises, but will it last? How can you ensure that this isn't just a temporary fix?" The manager leaned forward slightly, his expression thoughtful. "That's a great question, and it's one we've been asking ourselves. The truth is, it's going to take time to fully shift the culture here. But we're committed to doing the work. We've implemented a new monitoring system that will track customer feedback and staff performance on an ongoing basis. We're also creating a more transparent environment where customers can speak up if they feel their experience wasn't up to par." The woman nodded again, feeling reassured by the thoroughness of the plan. "I think that's a step in the right direction," she said. "But I also think it's important to make sure that the voices of those who've been most affected, like people of color, are heard. There needs to be a real understanding of the challenges people face in these spaces." The manager nodded in agreement. "Absolutely. We've already started incorporating feedback from a more diverse group of customers into our training programs. And moving forward, we're going to be more intentional about making sure that everyone feels represented, both in the services we provide and in the way we interact with our clients." For the next hour, they continued discussing the bank's initiatives, the challenges they were facing, and the steps they were taking to improve. The woman left the meeting feeling cautiously optimistic. It wasn't a perfect solution, and she knew that change wouldn't happen overnight. But she also knew that the bank was on the right path, and that her voice had made a difference. Over the next few weeks, she continued to visit the bank, each time noticing small improvements. The tellers were more attentive, the staff seemed more engaged, and there was an overall sense of warmth and respect that hadn't been there before. She could tell that the bank was working hard to make things right, and while there were still areas that needed improvement, she was encouraged by the progress they had made. As she walked out of the bank one day after completing another routine transaction, she felt a sense of pride. Not because everything was perfect, but because she had taken a stand, had spoken up when it mattered, and had been a part of something larger than herself. The woman knew that the road to real change wasn't always easy, but she also knew that every step forward was a victory. Weeks passed, and the woman found herself revisiting the bank every now and then, always keeping an eye out for the changes that had been promised. She didn't expect everything to change overnight. She knew that real transformation took time. But as she continued her visits, she began to see the small signs that things were moving in the right direction. It wasn't perfect, but there was a noticeable difference in the way the staff interacted with customers. The tellers were friendlier, the service was quicker, and there was a more welcoming atmosphere in the air. The most noticeable change was in the teller who had initially caused the problem. At first, he seemed hesitant and unsure around the woman whenever their paths crossed. But slowly, he began to open up. His smiles became more genuine, and his manner seemed less rigid. She could tell he was trying, and for the first time, she felt like he truly saw her as more than just another customer. It wasn't perfect, but the effort was there, and that meant something. One day, after a quick visit to deposit a check, the woman noticed a small flyer on the counter that caught her attention. It was about an upcoming community event that the bank was hosting, one aimed at fostering dialogue and connection among people from all walks of life. The event was to include workshops on financial literacy, as well as discussions about diversity and inclusion. The woman smiled to herself, thinking back to her initial experience at the bank. This was the kind of initiative that had been missing before. It wasn't just about fixing one isolated incident, it was about creating an environment where everyone felt valued, seen, and heard. Curious, she signed up for the event, deciding that it would be a good opportunity to see firsthand how the bank was continuing to implement its promises of inclusivity. The day of the event arrived, and the woman made her way to the bank's community room. As she walked through the door, she was immediately struck by how different the space felt. It was warm and inviting, with a large table in the center, covered in refreshments and materials about the bank's various programs. There was a welcoming energy in the air, and she could see people of different backgrounds already mingling and talking. The event kicked off with a short presentation about financial literacy, with tips on managing personal finances, saving, and investing. But as the presentation moved on, the focus shifted toward the bank's commitment to diversity and inclusion. The manager, who had been so instrumental in addressing her concerns, stood at the front of the room and spoke about the changes the bank had made. He acknowledged that the process was ongoing and that there was still much to be done, but he emphasized how important it was for the bank to create a space where everyone felt equal, no matter their race, gender, or background. The woman listened intently, appreciating the honesty in his words. She was glad to hear that the bank wasn't just talking about inclusivity, they were taking action. The manager spoke about the new diversity training programs, the ongoing feedback system, and the workshops that were now a regular part of the bank's operations. It was clear that they weren't just offering empty promises, they were genuinely invested in making a positive change. Later in the day, the attendees were divided into smaller groups to discuss their experiences. The woman found herself in a group with several other clients, all of whom had their own stories to share about feeling overlooked or marginalized in various spaces. As they exchanged their stories, she realized how much common ground they shared. Many of the clients spoke about subtle forms of discrimination they had faced, those small, everyday moments when they were treated as though they didn't belong, simply because of their appearance or background. It was a powerful reminder of why these conversations mattered and why spaces like the bank's community event were so important. As the conversation went on, the woman felt a sense of hope beginning to stir within her. She had always known that the world could be a better place if people took the time to listen to each other, to truly understand one another's experiences. This event was a small step toward that understanding. She looked around the room and saw people from all walks of life coming together to learn, to share, and to grow. It wasn't about pretending that everything was perfect, it was about acknowledging the problems and working together to solve them. By the end of the event, the woman felt a sense of pride in the bank's efforts, and in herself. She had played a small part in making a difference, and though she knew there was still work to be done, she felt encouraged by the progress that had been made. The woman wasn't naive, she understood that change wouldn't happen overnight, and she knew that challenges would continue to arise. But she also knew that she had helped start a conversation, and that conversation had the potential to grow into something larger than anyone could have imagined. As she left the event, the woman reflected on everything that had transpired over the past few weeks. She thought about the initial incident at the bank, how angry and frustrated she had felt, and how unsure she had been about what to do. But she also thought about how far the bank had come since then, how they had taken responsibility for their actions and worked hard to improve. And she thought about the small but meaningful ways in which the world was beginning to change, one step at a time. On her drive home, the woman realized something important. The journey toward equality and inclusivity was never easy, and it would never be completed in a day. But she knew that every effort, no matter how small, counted. She had seen firsthand how one person's voice could make a difference. And as long as she continued to speak up, to push for change, and to stand by those who needed support, she could make the world a little bit better for everyone. Months later, the woman continued to be a loyal client of the bank. She had seen real changes in the staff, the services, and the overall atmosphere. She no longer felt like an outsider when she walked into the branch. The teller who had once been so dismissive now greeted her with a smile, and the rest of the staff seemed more engaged, more invested in making sure every customer felt welcome. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. And in her heart, the woman knew that sometimes, all it takes is that first step toward progress.